Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to listen to it on demand. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access that webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And we'll take a few minutes near the end of today's presentation and go through the audience questions. And finally, at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you will be one of the 3 lucky winners. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Demystifying PCI Software Security Framework, all you need to know for your AppSec strategy. Our speakers today are Alexei Balaganski, who is lead analyst at KuppingerCole, and Jeremy Bailey, who is Application Development Manager at NSI. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today. Alexei, I know that you are going to get started with today's presentation, so I'll put myself on mute and let you get to it.
Well, thanks a lot, Charlene. And indeed, let's just dive directly into our today's topic without further ado. My name is Alexei Balaganski. I am, as mentioned, the lead analyst at KuppingerCole, Analyst, which is a Germany-based independent analyst company covering all aspects of cybersecurity. And my job here is to cover all aspects like application security and data protection and similar topics. Before I joined the company almost 15 years ago, I've actually been a software developer myself, doing quite a few of e-commerce related projects. So the topic of today's webinar is pretty close to my heart. And I guess we have to answer the following question first. Why? Why did PCI even bother releasing a completely new stack of the software security standards? Well, simply put, because the world has changed in the last decade. Everything now is connected, meaning that all your data, all your applications, all your identities, partners, customers, any other sensitive kind of asset is everywhere. It's no longer under your direct control, and most of the time you have to deal with lots of new, completely new attack vectors, threat challenges, compliance regulations, of course, and multiple other totally new problems. Well, obviously, the software development world has adapted, or at least evolved accordingly. As you can see, there have been so many new buzzwords, so many new methodologies, technology stacks, new architectures and paradigms recently. But most importantly, the software development, just like the IT as a whole, has evolved to being business-driven, collaborative, and intelligent. Everything now is quickly changing according to new business requirements. Business policies, business processes define everything else, including security. And those policies have to work across completely heterogeneous environments like on-prem and cloud, containers, serverless, IoT, you name it. And of course, all these changes are now driven by multiple business units and IT and development teams through the whole life cycle. If you look back at the timeline of all relevant PCI standards, you can see that it all started 15 years ago, basically with the first release of PCI DSS, governing just the rules of managing payment data securely. And then 4 years later, PA-DSS was announced, of governing the way you are supposed to develop your payment software to keep your payment data compatible to PCI DSS, basically. Again, in those 15 or 15 years, a lot has changed. The software, sorry, the PCI DSS and PA-DSS standards were upgraded multiple times. But again, they are simply too narrow in focus and execution, if you will, to address all the modern challenges. And finally, January 2019, we have the first announcement of the PCI Secure Software Framework. And the standard body has given us a generous 3 years extension time to transition from PA-DSS to PCI SSF slowly but surely and as smoothly as possible. And finally, in 2022, the PCI SSF will be the only governing standard in effect. So what is PCI Software Security Framework? It's a combination of two somewhat independent standards. One is called Secure Software Standard, the other one Secure Software Lifecycle Standard. Both actually address the same modern software development practices and technologies, but from slightly different perspective. The first one is primarily dealing with the way, how do you make your software secure? The second one is more likely, how do you reliably prove that what you did in the first part is actually fully compliant? The first part is primarily dealing with technologies. The second is primarily dealing with paperwork and business processes. Both, however, are radically different from PA-DSS in a way that they go way beyond just securing payment data, and in fact, way beyond from the traditional prescriptive approach. New standards are purely objective focused, meaning that they give you a free choice of multiple approaches, multiple tools or technologies to select from to achieve those goals. More importantly, that you have to be able to prove that you have achieved those goals. As I mentioned, it was initially released in this January. The first detailed information about the actual assessment program will probably appear later this summer, and the assessment will formally launch in the third quarter of the year. And again, you have 3 years period to transition. So let's talk about the first part, the PCI Secure Software Standard, which is a set of requirements and test procedures to help you ensure that your software, your payment software, does everything needed to protect the integrity and confidentiality of sensitive transaction and data. Who does it apply to? Well, obviously to any vendor that develops and sells or otherwise distributes payment software. To any vendor who is running this payment software as a service, for example, in the cloud. Although companies who are developing such software for in-house or like one customer, one use case scenarios are not formally required to take the test, they are nevertheless strongly advised to do that. And finally, companies who are actually operating payment software, again, they are not required to. They are still only subject to PCI DSS. But they are nevertheless strongly encouraged to be at least aware of the basic procedures, because a big part of the standard actually covers communications between the payment software vendor and the customer. What does it cover? It covers everything, basically. It covers all the processes which you as a vendor need to have in place to identify all the necessary software security controls, to cover all your payment software functionality, all the data interfaces and connections which are required to store, exchange, and process the data, all the infrastructure, the platforms and execution environments which host your payment software, if you will. More importantly, all third-party libraries, components, services, interfaces, APIs, and any other assets which are needed for your payment software to function properly. And we will cover that later. And of course, it has to formally incorporate all the communications and guidance which you as a vendor need to provide to your customers to ensure that your software is operated, or first of all, deployed, configured, and operated securely. Again, the key here is a complete software lifecycle. The second part, PCI Secure Software Lifecycle Standard, again, in a way, it has the same objectives for software vendors, but it establishes a completely different, more formal, more process and policies-oriented approach towards managing the security requirements. And every vendor who wish to perform their own software assessment for the first part of the standard are actually absolutely required to be covered by the second part as well. On the other hand, looking at the requirements and procedures in the standard, I would argue that any company, not just any software development company, but any company dealing with sensitive data, even outside of payment industry, should at least consider taking the standard as a general guidance for developing their own security strategy. Again, this part is primarily about paperwork and policies, which govern the full secure software lifecycle, starting from conceptual design to development, testing, deployment, configuration, operations, and eventual retirement. It covers all the software testing methods and their results. It addresses all the requirements and regulations covering your personnel involved in development, testing, management, and operations of the software, and basically establishes formal procedures for all aspects of secure software development, change management, version tracking, code validation, and so on. Guidance and communications with all stakeholders included. So let's dive deeper into exact requirements. And we will spend a little bit more time on the first part because it's more technology-oriented and slightly less on the second one. So these are four key, or officially called core requirements of the secure software standard. This is attack surface minimization, or you have to ensure that your software is designed to be as resilient and kind of minimized in a way that your sensitive assets are not exposed unnecessarily to the outside world. It has to be sufficiently protected, it has to be sufficiently invested in protecting the integrity and confidentiality of all those critical assets. It has to ensure that full life cycle of your software development is covered. And finally, it defines all the necessary controls which have to be deployed on your customer side to ensure secure operation of that software in production. And before we dive deeper into those specific recommendations, I'd like to spend a minute talking about general recommendations, if you will. Just like any other compliance framework in the area of IT security, I would always argue that it should not be seen as a burden or liability. It's a great enabler, especially if you compare it to slightly more complicated frameworks like GDPR, for example. I would argue that PCI SSF is much more flexible and prescriptive and guidance oriented to actually help you make your daily life easier, not more complicated. Again, since it's objective based, there is always more than one way to address each of those objectives. You have to stop thinking about tools and technologies, but start thinking about risks and identifying gaps and missing capabilities. You don't have to reinvent the wheel if there is already an existing tool which can cover some of those missing capabilities. You are strongly encouraged to reuse that tool, integrate it into your overall security strategy. And again, you have to focus on the big picture, think about the future, because those requirements will change in the future. So avoid quick wins, avoid amassing dozens of disjointed tools, only fixing single tiny problem. Think globally. You have to involve everyone in the company. not just the developers, not just the ops guys or security guys, all stakeholders, the management, HR, anyone, basically. Building a comprehensive security culture within your company is probably the most complicated and the most comprehensive requirement of the standard. You have to shift left and right, meaning that you have to change from applying security at one point of your development pipeline both ways into the area of proactive code analysis and others, proactive security measures, but as well into the rest of your DevOps cycle. You have to think beyond your own code because your software no longer ends where your own code ends. It incorporates third-party open source libraries, APIs, and other interfaces, including those of your maybe even partners and other suppliers. It incorporates execution environments, cloud infrastructure, and other layers of typical business software architecture. All those are your responsibility now. And finally, this is not a one-time process. You have to turn it into a continuous loop. So do steps 1 to 9, repeat. Okay, let's talk about attack surface minimization. As in any other area of security, you always start with identifying all your critical assets. And in fact, assets in the new standards are defined way broader than before. It not just covers your payment data, but any kind of sensitive information within the software, as well as information needed to operate the software, like credentials, encryption keys, configuration settings, and so on. You have to identify them first, how you do it. Again, you have more than one way. And obviously, you already have at least some of those technologies in place. If you are dealing with database security, for example, and you should definitely have some kind of a data discovery and classification solution. Incorporate those into your software, into your secure software lifecycle. If you are thinking about sensitive resources like, again, functions, interfaces, APIs, or execution environment configuration, and so on, those are hopefully already covered within your CI/CD pipeline, whether it cloud infrastructure or, say, container orchestration platform, or again, APIs. There are multiple existing tools which either partially or more holistically cover those attack surfaces. And it's your job now to identify which ones you already have, which you still lack, and how to cover those gaps. In the end, you have to have a comprehensive and constantly updated inventory of all those critical assets. The second key requirement is having secure defaults. This is probably the number one reason of all those data breaches and botnets and hijacked accounts and other types of application exploits. You have to ensure that all your interfaces and parts of the software which are exposed to the world are identified, analyzed, and ideally either no longer exposed, or at least you have a justifiable business reason for having them, for keeping them exposed. You have to identify and eliminate all the hard-coded and default credentials, both in your code, in your execution environment, and even in your hardware. And again, there are existing solutions for doing that, ranging from traditional static code analysis tools to API security solutions to privileged account management. You'll probably end up combining more than one, but at least you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Look out for existing capabilities and combine them. And finally, you have to enforce the least privilege principle for all system and administrative accounts. Again, this is a very mature aspect of IT security, privileged access management, check it out. If you don't have it, you must. Sensitive data retention is perhaps the biggest core requirement by value or area, if you will, because sensitive data is the bread and butter. It's your key, or rather your customer's key business asset, and you have to invest a lot into ensuring that this data is not just secured properly, but you also have full control over its life cycle. You have to demonstrate that you are only collecting the data which is needed, that you retaining and securing it at rest, in transit, and in use, and ensure that it's somehow masked, anonymized, or simply removed after use when it's no longer needed. Again, I could probably talk several hours just about this particular area. There is a lot of data protection and database security and data governance solutions out there. You're welcome. Sorry for this shameless plug. You're welcome to visit our own website. We have recently published some research in that area. But let me reiterate, you don't have to invent the wheel. You don't have to come up with your own homemade data protection solution. You're all covered by the market already. The second large key area is software protection. So you have to ensure that all those critical assets you have identified before are protected appropriately. And you always start that by creating a threat model, by assessing all the potential risks those assets can be exposed to, cataloging them, identifying potential impact and probability of each of those risks, and then document all the mitigation controls in place for addressing those risks. Again, there is no single answer to that, because obviously you will end up combining multiple solutions at each stage of that software development lifecycle. This is why I was mentioning shifting in all directions at the same time. You have to make your code more secure by eliminating vulnerabilities proactively. You have to protect your existing APIs by, for example, covering them with automated monitoring and protection solutions. You have to manage your access controls and so on. There is more than one solution for each of those areas. And again, you always start with a strategy. Authentication access control, obviously. You have to implement a role-based access model for ensuring that your sensitive assets are only accessible to those who have the business need to access them. Strong and multi-factor authentication is a must, just like before. Introducing policy and context-based authentication is probably a new requirement, a very interesting one. The traditional MFA is a one-time, is a kind of point-in-time process. You only authenticate once, and then throughout the whole session, you are implicitly trusted. This no longer works. You have to implement real-time controls, real-time solutions for constantly re-evaluating your client's security posture and adjusting his kind of risk assessment accordingly. As soon as your existing session drops below some sort of risk threshold, maybe initiate a new authentication session, for example. And again, there are so many existing solutions and frameworks out there. I can only encourage you to look for guidance with analysts and vendors and other publications. There is always more than one way. Obviously, avoid sharing accounts, avoid using shared accounts, avoid unchecked and unlimited access, and always ensure that your access is justified and minimized and only available for the time needed to perform a specific business function. As I mentioned, securing data at every stage of processing is a must. And not only data itself, but all the appropriate cryptographic materials. So not just encrypting the data is a must, but you have to ensure that the key management for that encryption is also done securely according to standard certifications with hardware-backed key management and so on. Obviously, never ever invest into proprietary or homegrown cryptography. This has been proven not to work many times. Secure software operations. Yeah, that is all that applies to the stage where the software is already operating at your customer site. This is where customers are supposed to be involved as well, obviously, but you as a vendor have to ensure that you provide them with all the necessary tools and processes and guidance to ensure that safe operations. Obviously, everything has to be logged and audited, not just administrative, but all access to all sensitive assets. It's specifically written in the standard that it has to incorporate detailed security relevant context. For example, it has to incorporate not just the fact that something was accessed, but also time of the day, scope, duration, associated identity, and so on. All this will greatly help later in case of a breach to simplify the forensic analysis. And for that purpose, you have to ensure that all the records are securely stored and tamper-proof. And again, security analytics platforms are perhaps the most explosively growing market segment nowadays. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. You will definitely find existing solutions which can not just be incorporated into all aspects of your software development lifecycle and operations lifecycle, but also feed directly into other more security-related, forensic-related tools later. More importantly, you have to ensure that this audit trail is protected against failures. So there is no excuse later if you say, sorry, because of a disk failure, we lost our records for last week. Sorry, this won't work in the future. You have to ensure that those records are protected against failures. And of course, you have to invest into at least basic detection of anomalous behavior. And I would again like to stress basic because you don't have to build a full antivirus or an IDS into your software, but you are now required to build basic detection of anomalous behavior. For example, if you have a login form somewhere, you have to ensure that it cannot be abused for brute forcing login attempts. Sorry. You have to log all the configuration changes. You have to detect integrity of your own executables and so on. So the basic checks have to be built in directly into your software. And of course, those checks have to be constant, ideally real time. And those checks have to plug into existing security, more general security tools. Last but not least, secure software lifecycle management covers various stages of your software product's future life. You are now explicitly required to provide a defined secure software update procedure for your customers to ensure that they are not just getting the software updates as soon as you have them. You have to ensure that this communication is bidirectional, that you inform them of all the necessary changes and migration procedures if they are needed, and you have to maintain full history of this communication because you will have to show them to your auditors. And of course, it has to cover all the third-party components as well, including open source ones. Threat and vulnerability management has to incorporate all those stages as well. You have to, identifying those vulnerabilities is already probably a big part of your software development cycle, but it has to be uniform, comprehensive, traceable, tamper-proof again, and you are legally obliged to have this trail available for your auditors at any time in the future. Last but not least, you are supposed to provide quote-unquote verbal security guidance to your customers, that at any time when they have problems separating the software, they know whom to contact and they know how to get that guidance and support from you as a vendor. Well, the second part covers secure software lifecycle, and I guess we don't have to go into every detail because, again, it's all about paperwork primarily. For all those requirements we just covered on a technology basis, in this part you are required to have a formal governance and business process that establishes, documents, formalizes, codifies those procedures, including not just the actual process, but all the stakeholders involved, all the responsibilities assigned, everything documented, everything written into policies, and so on. So these are 4 key requirements which cover security governance, secure engineering, secure data management, and secure communications, which we already addressed earlier. Just a little bit more paperwork. So I won't go into details. These are the key requirements. You will probably be able to download the slides later and read them through as well. And of course, you are invited to read the actual specification, but basically, trust me, it's all the same, just with more paperwork. Okay. Secure communications again. So as you can see, to be able to fully comply with the full standard, you basically have to do everything which you are already required to do, if not just by any existing standard, but by common sense, by basic security, hygiene, and best practices and patterns. You just have to do it in a more guided and formalized and documented way, and you have to leave a full audit trail of all those actions. In a way, I would argue that the standard as a whole is a great piece of security guidance for any company, for any type of software development and operations, even fully outside of payment industry. So to anyone involved in software development and looking for some clearly defined and flexible guidance, read the standard. It's all there and it's pretty manageable, if you will. I would like to focus, however, a little bit on the software big picture. Unfortunately, some software developers still have this interesting belief that their software ends where their own code ends. So in this quote-unquote onion diagram, they will only focus on the red core of the onion. It's no longer that, and it has never actually been like that, but the new standard explicitly codifies that requirement. You are formally responsible for not just your own code, but all the third-party components, including and primarily the open source ones, which, as the statistics tell us, cover almost 80% of your application code nowadays. All APIs and interfaces, again, not just your own, but the third-party as well. Security of execution environment, being an application server or a cloud infrastructure or even a serverless framework, is again your responsibility now, including all those third-party tools, products, and services which are required to operate your software. And finally, the communications with your partners and customers, they are codified again, and you bear full responsibility for making those communications comprehensive and secure as well. And finally, since our host for today is a company deeply involved with open source management, let's just talk why it's such an important part of the standard. On all of these aspects of software development lifecycle, starting with identifying vulnerabilities and security gaps in the code, all the way to cybersecurity threats and risk management, DevOps lifecycle, software hardening, communications, and even legal problems. Open source third-party libraries play a very important role. In some aspects, as I mentioned, it could be a major part of your own software code. Obviously, the execution platforms are very often open source based. And software hardening applies to them as well, and risk management. So have your open source components under control. If you do it in a consistent and fully documented way, you have already covered a substantial part of those standard requirements. And finally, this is my last slide for today. Just a few key takeaways. So even though you have 3 years left, don't wait, start today. Because you have to at least know what you're supposed to do. You have to evaluate your current stand and define a strategy. And that strategy has to be focused on risks and not compliance. Well, you should never treat compliance requirements as the goal and not just a means to reach a business goal. But especially for PCI SSF, there are no goals in this standard, only objectives. And those objectives are for you to evaluate, because these are your business risks and your defenses, and you have more than one way to address them. Start with general awareness and security culture, because without that, the rest of the processes will just never fly. Again, shift in all directions, expand your coverage to each step of the security or the software security lifecycle. Cover all your bases, as I mentioned, all the layers of that software onion. And again, do not forget about software composition management. And with that, I guess, thank you for listening. And I have to give the stage to Jeremy for his part of the webinar.
Thank you, Alexei. I am Jeremy Bailey. I'm the Application Development Manager for NSI. We are actually a reseller and distributor of safety supplies. We started out selling Band-Aids out of a truck in 1983 and now have expanded to over 30 locations and 600 associates. We've gone from no technology to a full ID department with custom development, business intelligence, and network security. We have built our own custom e-commerce solution, which is integrated with a third-party payment gateway. We've been writing custom applications for our business for over 20 years now, and we've tried to keep pace with the new technologies and best practices. And as our development has continued, we've used more and more open source, usually as small libraries to assist with functionality. In the past few years, we have been more active with DevOps and PCI compliance. And with DevOps, that included continuous integration, deployment, testing. And our development team consists of over 25 developers who manage 15 separately deployed applications, each using a different set of open source technologies. So a couple of years ago, when we were seriously going through an internal PCI assessment, and I should also say our code doesn't directly touch a credit card. But we do write the code that integrates with the credit card. We wanted to make sure that we were following the intent and the security ideas of the PCI compliance. And I remember one of the tough questions I had to answer was, what packages do we use? What third-party packages do we use? And do they contain any vulnerabilities? What is the latest version? Are we behind versions? My first attempt at a solution was to write down a list in Excel, go to the different websites, check versions, look for updates and vulnerabilities. But I quickly discovered that this was not feasible, as we had hundreds of packages scattered throughout our different applications, sometimes different versions in different applications. So I knew I needed an automated solution. I spent some time searching the internet, And actually, that is where I found our host, WhiteSource, and I found their technology. At this point, since we were already using the DevOps best practices, I already had automated pipelines. So I was quickly able to integrate their service into our pipeline. And after all of our applications rebuilt, I had a complete list of my packages, the vulnerabilities, and the best of all, that this list was always up to date. And I didn't have to keep on going out to different websites to find out that information. So looking ahead at this whole new PCI framework, I'm feeling very confident because of our choices in the DevOps best practices, that we will be well prepared to have a compliant security strategy. I'll say I love the slides from Alexei on the 10 recommendations. I can identify with all of those steps as things that we have been integrating into our software development practice. And the 4 major areas that he went over in part 1, most of those concepts are what we bring in as developers to our best practices for secure software development. Our CI/CD environment automatically gave us auditing, logging, release controls, separation of concerns. This wasn't something I had to go out and find a specific solution for that. Just by getting into continuous integration and continuous deployment, I was then able to go back to these PCI controls and found that we satisfied, the areas of concern that were presented by PCI. And as I mentioned, we don't directly handle credit cards, and I know that was mentioned by Alexei that we fall out of scope, but these are things that we should be aware of and following, because even if we don't follow or are required to follow the PCI compliance, our code may have intellectual property. We have personally identifiable data within code or within our databases, and any of those insecure software practices can definitely cost my business money, loss of our intellectual property, and they provide, by following those best practices, we provide those safeguards to secure our information in our process. And as I said, I'm very excited almost about this next phase because it's not that different from some of the best practices that we've already been going down in terms of secure software. And as I said, we are implementer of WhiteSource as one of the solutions to identify those vulnerabilities. And during the Q&A, if people have questions, we can go over how we found some particular solutions to our needs. And with that, I will pass off the organization.
Okay, Alexei, do you have any last points before we go into the question and answer period?
Well, if you still have to wait for a few seconds before the first question arrives, I will just say, as you can see, with Jeremy, we just had a living proof of my initial message that the new PCI SSF is not a liability, it's not a burden, it's just a way to validate that what you have been doing all the time is good. And if there are still some gaps left, then it's just a gentle guidance for you to keep up with all the recent developments, and you have 3 years for that. So in a way, compared to companies suffering from GDPR, you are very much lucky because this is definitely a very positive and timely development from the PCI side. And with that, I guess we can start with questions.
Okay, great. So we've gotten a few questions in, but there's plenty of time. If you have a question for either one of our panelists, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll get to the first one right now. Would there be an option to only comply to PCI DSS as a subset of the larger PCI SSF space, or would it be a case of PCI SSF in its entirety or nothing?
Well, let's just check that we get the question right. PCI DSS has nothing to do with software. PCI DSS covers managing the payment data securely. It actually applies to anyone who even touches stuff like credit card numbers. We are Analyst, we are not a software development company, but we have to be compliant with PCI DSS because we accept payments for our services, right? And we will continue to do so, and anyone will continue to do so. So PCI DSS, there were some talks that it will be eventually incorporated into future version of the SSF, but at the moment, these are two very much separate requirements covering very different aspects of security.
Okay, all right, great. So we had a follow-up question to that, which is follow-up from that, who would need to comply? Only vendors storing personal, well, PAN, P-A-N, or would it now extend to all types of code developed to run PII/PHI/PAN?
Well, at the moment, it applies to, well, obviously, payment software vendors, because this is a payment card council, if you will. So it's all about financial information at the moment. But again, there is nothing in the standard which explicitly limits its usability to any other type of sensitive data. So the formal validation program will probably apply to vendors who actually develop and sell or operate their software on behalf of their customers. So those will definitely have to comply. For the rest, for example, who are only performing in-house development, they don't formally. But again, I would encourage any software development company to at least do some kind of a self-validation.
All right, great. Next question. Let's see. When will this be mandatory?
Well, as I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, after the introduction of the standard, there is a 3-year transition period. So it will gradually replace existing PA-DSS validations within the 3 years. I think sometime next year, they will stop accepting new applications for the old standard and only accept new applications for the new one. And then for the remaining 2 years, the old validations will kind of naturally expire. So in 2022, everyone is supposed to fully migrate to the new framework.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Great. Next question. I work for a managed service provider, and we develop a platform for merchants. Would we be required to do this?
Well, quote unquote, I am not a lawyer, but I very much suspect that yes, definitely. And then again, so even if for whatever strange twist of law you are not legally required to do it, I would still recommend to do it just for your own peace of mind, if you will.
I was just going to add that, Alexei. Why wouldn't you want to be following these best practices?
This is really one of those rare standards which are actually win-win for any involved party, because they are not hard to implement unless you are already hopelessly behind all those best practices. And they are actually beneficial for each involved party, and there is really any good software development company is already expected to follow this requirement. So it just, if only to validate that you are doing things right, this is already worth it.
Okay. All right, great. Next question. What was the biggest challenge in integrating open source development with new packages into DevSecOps processes?
Well, Jeremy,
Yeah.
once we were set up with white source and had that in our release pipeline, there really wasn't much of a challenge. The developers were free to, in a sense, add any package that they found, and as they built, security scans would come up in that way, and because it was integrated into our process, we could see if there were any vulnerabilities raised or any high alerts, and we could even, if we needed to, we weren't set up this way, but if we needed to, we could even stop the builds from running if they don't pass certain security validations. So because of our system and the way that we integrated it into our DevOps practices, there really weren't many challenges. Developers could just use whatever they wanted to, and if alerts came up, we would then discuss it internally.
All right, great.
If I may add to that,
Sure.
of course, I don't have any recent hands-on experience with it since I'm long time no longer a developer. But judging from our kind of own customers' interactions, I say the biggest challenge is understanding the scope. It's basically understanding that, again, you do not just need to deal with your own code, which maybe includes some Apache license libraries, but you have to go through the whole application stack, through each layer, and you will definitely find some open source components in each of those layers, even where you had no idea you have those. And I guess the same approach applies to almost any area of modern cybersecurity. You have to think big. You have to cover all those onion layers in your strategy.
All right, great. Okay, next question. In the future, how would compliance to this standard be validated? Would it be independent testing authorities or self-assessment only?
Well, here we come to an area when, again, I'm not a lawyer, and unfortunately, the actual assessment program is not yet published, so I cannot give you a formal answer. But according to the preliminary information, yes, there will be a formal program which will be available through assigned companies, third-party companies, kind of assessors, or however you call them properly, which will do it for you. So no, self-assessment is almost not an option. I think the only way you can do partial self-assessment is when you first qualify for that second part of the framework. So if you can demonstrate that you do not just develop the software in the right way, but you can actually you have all the formal processes and governance in place, then yes, you will be able to submit deltas as self-assessments. Basically, if something small changes, you can inform your official assessor that, yeah, you have changed it, and you don't need to do the full reassessment immediately. You can wait for the next one in the plan. So that will probably be the only option.
All
but then
right.
again, we have to wait probably a month or two before the official programs will be published.
Okay. All right. So watch this space, guys. Okay. Next question. If you utilize any other software solution in your solution, do they need to be PCI PA-DSS compliant as well?
I'm thinking hard about it.
Wouldn't it be the same as open source, but it's closed source?
It just says
do you OEM a third-party technology, or can your payment software not operate without another payment software from a different vendor? Anyway, usually, each vendor, I guess, is responsible for validating their own product, right? If your product includes a third-party OEM technology, I'm afraid I cannot give you a legally sound answer to that. It's an interesting question to investigate and follow up.
All right, great. Yeah, it looks like he was actually agreeing with you, Jeremy. I don't know if that helps shed some light.
I mean, because it's closed source, it won't be, able to be scanned in the same way that open source is. I think that goes back to that legal, question.
I mean, it will definitely have to be validated. The question is who is responsible for, like you as a, or that third-party vendor. That's the interesting part of the question, I guess. This is why we just cannot give
right.
you.
It's a conundrum. Okay.
If you have doubts about that third party, maybe you shouldn't use them.
Yeah. All right. Good advice. Good advice. Okay. Great. Well, we are about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, and that looks to be all the questions that we have from the audience. So I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. There were some really good ones there. Before we close things out, I know I promised that we would do a drawing for 3 Amazon gift cards at $50 each. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and do that drawing. And our first winner here is Eric Pruss. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Eric, but congratulations. Our next winner is Sherry Zafar. Congratulations, Sherry. And our final winner is, and I know I'm going to kill this name, and I apologize in advance, Jaron Janke or Yaron Janke, I guess depending on how you pronounce it. But congratulations to our 3 winners. We'll be following up with you following today's webinar to get those Amazon gift cards out to you. So. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to listen to it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We will be sending out an email later on this afternoon that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the Security Boulevard website, so you can always go there. Just go to www.securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it will be right there waiting for you. Alexei and Jeremy, both, thank you so much for giving such a great presentation today. Lots of good information. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I want to thank the audience also for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Goodbye.